He didn't even look up from his papers when she knocked. That was the thing Claire Hawthorne remembered most afterward. Not the words, not the cold air of the 43rd floor conference room, not the Manhattan skyline pressing against the glass like a painting nobody asked for. What she remembered was that Adrian Volkov, the man she had shared a bed with for 6 years, the man who once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm because she had a fever and he couldn't sleep knowing she was alone, that man didn't even lift his eyes when she appeared in the doorway. She had come upstairs. That was her first mistake, or maybe her last act of hope. She was never entirely sure which. She had waited 53 minutes in the lobby of Volkov Tower, sitting in one of those stiff chairs that were designed to look expensive rather than feel it, watching his security team rotate in and out with the mechanical precision of men who had stopped thinking about why they did what they did a long time ago. She had told herself 10 more minutes every 10 minutes, the way people do when they already know the answer but aren't ready to stop asking the question. Then Marcus Webb, Adrian's head of security, had come down himself. Marcus, who had known Claire since before the wedding, who had once carried her groceries 4 blocks in the rain because she refused to take the car service and he refused to let her walk alone. Marcus had looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something tired, something almost guilty. Mrs. Volkov, he's finishing up with the Castellano people. It shouldn't be more than, I'll go up, she said. Marcus had hesitated. That hesitation told her everything, but she went anyway. The elevator doors opened onto the 43rd floor, and she heard Adrian's voice before she saw him, that low, controlled register he used in rooms where every word was being measured. She moved down the corridor toward the half-open conference room door, and she was almost at the threshold when she heard Marcus's voice behind her, having followed her up, speaking quietly to Adrian through a second entrance on the far side of the room. "Sir, your wife has been waiting downstairs for almost an hour. She mentioned dinner." There was a pause, the kind of pause that in another version of her life she would have filled with hope. "She does this every Thursday," Adrian said. His voice carried no frustration, no warmth either, just information being processed. "It's a pattern. She's been asking about this particular Thursday for 2 weeks. I believe she wanted to celebrate something." Another pause, shorter. "Marcus." A sound of papers moving. "If Claire walked away today..." Claire's hand found the doorframe. "I wouldn't care." She didn't make a sound. That was the thing she would turn over later in the dark, in the first weeks and then the first months. That she hadn't cried, hadn't dropped anything, hadn't made the small involuntary noise that usually escapes a person when something breaks inside them. She had simply stood at the doorframe and felt the sentence move through her the way cold water moves through a space. It was always going to fill eventually. She turned around. She walked back down the corridor. She pressed the elevator button once, and when the doors opened, she stepped inside, and she watched the number above the door count down from 43, and she thought about the apple pie sitting in the back seat of the car she had borrowed because her own car was getting new brake pads, and she hadn't wanted to cancel again. The pie was from Hartley's Bakery on West 74th, the one that had been there since before either of them was born. She had gone that afternoon specifically because Adrian had mentioned Hartley's exactly once, 3 years ago, saying he used to walk past it as a teenager, and the smell coming through the door was the first thing he could remember that made New York feel like somewhere a person might actually belong. She had remembered that the way she remembered most of the small things he'd said, stored carefully, because small things were mostly what she'd had. She had also written a note, 4 sentences on the back of a grocery receipt because she hadn't had anything else in her bag. 30 minutes. That was all she was asking for. 30 minutes, and the pie, and whatever was left of Thursday evening. She left both on the kitchen island in the penthouse apartment where they technically still lived together, though Adrian slept there perhaps 9 or 10 nights a month. She placed the pie in the center and the note beneath it where he would see it when he lifted the box. Then she left. She didn't take anything. She had a jacket, her bag, her phone. She took the stairs because she didn't want to be in the elevator if Marcus came up behind her trying to manage the situation, trying to smooth things over, the way good staff smoothed things over for powerful men whose wives occasionally became inconveniences. She walked 6 blocks before she felt her legs properly again. She had met Adrian Volkov at a benefit auction for a children's hospital, which was the kind of setting that made everything about what came after seem like a cosmic joke she hadn't been in on. She was 31. He was 34. She was there because a colleague had bought 2 tickets and given her one at the last minute, and she had gone because she didn't have a good enough reason not to. He was there because he gave money to children's hospitals the way powerful men gave money to things that made them appear to be other than what they were, which was not a thing Claire understood at the time because she wasn't looking for it. What she saw was a man standing slightly apart from every group in the room, not because he was shy. She understood that immediately, but because the room arranged itself around him the way water arranged itself around a stone. He had dark eyes and the kind of stillness that read at first as confidence, and only later, much later, revealed itself to be something closer to control. He didn't laugh at things that weren't funny. He didn't fill silences because they made him uncomfortable. He looked at her when she spoke, actually looked, and at 31, after years of men who were present only in body, that had felt like something extraordinary. He had asked for her number by writing his own on a cocktail napkin and sliding it across the high-top table without fanfare, and she had called him 2 days later because she was not the kind of person who played at being less interested than she was. Their first 3 years had not been simple. She was not naive about what he was. Not entirely. Things became clear in layers, the way cold does when you've been outside longer than you realized. He never lied to her outright about the nature of his work. He simply never described it in terms that required her to confront it directly, and she had accepted that arrangement because she loved him and because the man she loved in those years was present in a way she had never expected from anyone. He had driven 4 hours in a snowstorm. He had remembered the names of her students, so she taught adult literacy at a community center then, before the marriage made her schedule someone else's. And he asked about them the way people ask about things they actually care about, not the way people ask to appear like they do. He had once sat beside her for 3 hours while she cried about her mother without trying to fix anything or leave, which she had loved him for more than almost anything else. That man had not vanished all at once. He had faded. Slowly, the way daylight fades on a winter afternoon, so gradually you keep thinking it's still bright enough to see, and then suddenly you can't read anything at all. The divorce of their lives had happened long before any paperwork. It happened in the 2nd year of his expanded operation, when the calls started coming at 2 in the morning and he stopped turning his phone face down out of consideration for her sleep. It happened in the 3rd year, when he began taking meals in his office because there were always people waiting, always something that couldn't wait. It happened in year 4, when she stopped setting 2 places at the kitchen island because the 2nd setting had started to feel like an accusation. She had never made demands she knew were impossible. She had not expected him to be something he wasn't. But she had believed. She had genuinely believed, and this was the part that burned later, that she was somewhere in the structure of his life. Not first, maybe. She had understood from the beginning that a man like Adrian Volkov did not put people first, but somewhere in the order of things that mattered to him, she had believed she existed. Thursday dinners had been her idea 18 months ago. 1 evening a week. That was the proposal she had made with the same calm practicality she brought to everything, not pleading, not ultimatuming, just presenting. 1 evening. Dinner, conversation, no phones. Whatever was left of them by then, she wanted to tend it the way you tend something you aren't ready to let die. He had agreed. He had meant it when he agreed. She believed that too because she had watched his face and Adrian's face when he was telling you the truth, did a particular thing that she had never fully been able to describe but would have recognized anywhere. But intentions and presence were different things, and the empire had a gravity of its own. And Thursday after Thursday he was late, or unavailable, or physically there, but so distracted he might as well have been on the 43rd floor. She had eaten alone. She had kept the food warm longer than was reasonable. She had stopped saying anything about it because saying something required a fight she didn't have left in her. And silence, at least, preserved something. Tonight was going to be different. She had decided that 2 weeks ago with a clarity that arrived not as anger, but as something quieter and more final. Tonight she was going to sit across from her husband, and she was going to say something she hadn't been able to say before. That she was disappearing from this marriage, and she needed to know if he noticed, needed to know if there was anything left in him that could be brought back to the place they had started. She had baked the pie herself, then thrown it out because it was lopsided and she wanted it to be right, then driven to Hartley's because she didn't have time to try again. She had written the note. She had waited 53 minutes in the lobby, and then she had walked down a corridor and stood at a door frame and heard the sentence that answered her question completely. I wouldn't care. Not I have to finish this meeting. Not tell her I'm sorry. Not even the flat dishonesty of I'll be right there. Just a verdict, delivered without feeling, about the possibility of her absence. As though the question of Claire Hawthorne's departure from his life was a logistical matter, about as significant as a minor rescheduling. She was 6 blocks away when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but she recognized the prefix, one of the secure lines from the Volkov office network. She watched it ring. She let it go to voicemail. No message was left. She walked to the subway station at West 68th and stood on the platform and watched the downtown train arrive and felt, underneath the numbness, something she had not expected. Relief. Not the relief of escape, not yet, but the relief of certainty, of knowing, of the question that had been sitting in her chest for 18 months finally having its answer, spoken in her husband's own voice without the softening of a lie or the kindness of a deflection. She rode the train to a stop she'd been visiting in secret for 7 weeks, a neighborhood in Brooklyn where the rents were manageable and the streets had the specific kind of unglamorous ordinariness that Manhattan had long since priced away. She walked up 3 flights of stairs to an apartment that smelled like fresh paint and old wood floors and held almost nothing: a mattress, a folding table, 2 chairs she'd found secondhand, her books in stacked boxes because she hadn't bought shelves yet. She had signed the lease on a Tuesday afternoon while Adrian was in Baltimore for a meeting she hadn't asked about. She had not told anyone. She had packed slowly over the preceding weeks, 1 bag at a time, removing things from the penthouse so gradually that the disappearance had happened too quietly for anyone to track. Clothes first, then the books she cared most about, then the framed photograph of her mother and the small ceramic bowl her former students had given her when she'd gotten married, the one with their handprints pressed into the clay. She hadn't taken the wedding photograph. She'd left that. She sat down on the edge of the mattress in the Brooklyn apartment and looked at her hands for a long time. The pie was still in the lobby of Volkov Tower. The note was in the penthouse kitchen. The wedding photograph was on the mantel above a fireplace that had been lit maybe twice in 3 years. She had not planned what would come next. She had only planned what she could no longer do. She could no longer wait in lobbies. She could no longer eat dinner alone beside a place setting that no one intended to fill. She could no longer be a woman who was present in someone's life without actually being in it, who existed in the architecture of a marriage the way furniture existed in a room, noted, necessary for the appearance of the space, never truly considered. If Claire walked away today, I wouldn't care. She lay back on the mattress. The ceiling of the Brooklyn apartment had a water stain in one corner shaped like nothing in particular. She looked at it for a very long time. Outside, the city moved the way the city always moved, without concern for any individual's private catastrophe. And Claire Hawthorne, who had waited 53 minutes and baked 1 pie and written 1 note asking for 30 minutes of the time of a man who would not care if she walked away, felt the first careful architecture of something new beginning to form in the place where the old thing had just finally, completely broken. She did not cry. She had the feeling she would not cry for a while yet, that the crying would come later, in smaller and more unexpected pieces, and that she would let it when it came. But tonight she only lay on the mattress in the Brooklyn apartment and breathed, in and out, in the plain specific fact of a space that was entirely, irrevocably her own. Adrian Volkov returned to the penthouse at 11:47. He saw the pie box on the kitchen island. He lifted it, read the note. She had asked for 30 minutes. She had said she missed him. She had signed it simply C, the way she always did. And he placed the note back beneath the box and stood there for approximately 12 seconds. Then he took a bottle of water from the refrigerator and went to his office and returned 3 calls that had come in after 10. He did not wonder where she was. He told himself she was staying with her friend Diane, the way she did sometimes when he worked late, and she didn't want to rattle around the penthouse alone. He told himself she was fine. He told himself Thursday next week would be better because he actually believed, in whatever part of him still operated on that particular frequency, that there would always be another Thursday. He had no idea the pie was from Hartley's. He had no idea she had gone there specifically because of something he'd said 3 years ago that she had been holding all that time like something valuable. He had no idea about any of it. That was the precise nature of the damage he had done. Not that he had meant to cause it, but that he had caused it so completely without noticing that the woman standing at the edge of his life had been there so long without anyone looking that she had simply, quietly, learned how to leave. The pie sat on the kitchen island for 2 days. Adrian walked past it Friday morning on his way to the coffee machine, registered it the way he registered most things in the penthouse that weren't his, as background, as part of the furniture of a life he inhabited without fully occupying. He had meetings at 7, a call with the Marseille connection at 9, a problem in the Newark operation that needed resolution before noon. He did not open the box. He did not reread the note. He told his driver he needed to be at Volkov Tower by 6:45, and he was. It was Marcus who found the note still tucked beneath the pie box Saturday afternoon when he came by the penthouse to drop off a briefing folder Adrian had forgotten. Marcus read it without meaning to. The paper was right there, unfolded, 4 sentences in handwriting he recognized immediately because Claire Hawthorne had the specific handwriting of a woman who had learned it before people stopped caring about handwriting. Deliberate, clear. Each letter placed like it meant something. 30 minutes. That's all I'm asking for. I made something from Hartley's because you mentioned it once, and I remembered. I miss you, and I think you've forgotten that's allowed. See, Marcus stood in the kitchen for a moment with the note in his hand. Then he set it back exactly where he'd found it and left the briefing folder on the counter beside the box and walked out. He did not say anything to Adrian about it. He told himself that wasn't his place. He'd been telling himself that for about 4 years now, and he was getting tired of how easy the excuse came. Whoa. By Sunday, the penthouse had a particular quality to its silence that Marcus noticed when he returned for a secondary security sweep. Something different from the usual silence of a space whose owner was rarely home. This was emptier. He stood in the main hallway and looked at the side table where Claire usually left her keys, her lip balm, the small folded piece of paper with whatever was on her mind that week, her running list of things she needed or wanted to remember. The table was clear. He went to the kitchen. The pie box was gone. The note was gone. He walked to the bedroom and opened the closet on her side, a thing he had no right to do and did anyway, and looked at what remained, which was the formal dresses she never wore, the shoes she'd bought for events she'd attended alone, the winter coat with the broken zipper she kept meaning to have fixed. The everyday things were gone. The things a person actually needed were gone. He closed the closet. He called Adrian. "She's not here," he said when Adrian picked up. "She's at Diane's." "Sir?" Marcus kept his voice flat. "Her clothes are gone. The things she uses every day. This wasn't a weekend." There was a silence on the line. Not long. Adrian processed things quickly. It was one of the things that made him what he was. "How much is gone?" "Enough." Another silence. "Find out where she is. And when I find her first," Adrian said. "We'll figure out the rest." The call ended. Marcus stood in the middle of Claire Volkov's empty closet and breathed through his nose and thought about a woman who had sat in the lobby of this man's building for 53 minutes and then gone upstairs anyway, because she had apparently not quite finished hoping. He started making calls. It took him 4 days. Not because Claire had hidden herself badly. She hadn't tried to vanish, hadn't changed her phone number or emptied the joint accounts or done any of the things a woman with resources and motive might do when she was genuinely running. She had simply gone somewhere nobody thought to look, because nobody had been paying attention to what her life looked like outside the penthouse and the charity functions and the role of Adrian Volkov's wife. The apartment was in Brooklyn, 3rd floor, lease in her own name, signed 5 weeks before she left. 5 weeks. Marcus sat with that number for a while. 5 weeks meant she hadn't left on impulse. 5 weeks meant she had gone to Brooklyn and looked at an apartment and signed a lease and started moving her things a piece at a time, while Adrian sat at his desk 43 floors above Manhattan, Running an empire he believed was the most complicated thing in his life. He went to Adrian's office with the address and the information about the lease date. He did not soften it. "She signed it 5 weeks ago," he said. Adrian was standing at the window. He didn't turn around. "Say that again." "The lease?" "She signed it 5 weeks before she left." The silence this time was different. Marcus had worked for Adrian Volkov for 11 years. He had watched the man sit across tables from people who wanted him dead and never show a thing. He watched him now and saw something move across the back of his neck, a tightening, a micro-adjustment of the shoulders that in anyone else Marcus might have called distress. "She was planning it," Adrian said. Not a question, just the fact being turned over. "Looks that way." "While she was still here?" "Yes." Adrian turned from the window. His face had done the thing it did when he was incorporating something unpleasant, gone very still, very precise, the way a surgeon's hands go still before they cut. "She wanted out 5 weeks ago, and I didn't know." "You didn't notice," Marcus said, because he was tired and because it was true, and because he'd made a decision somewhere between the lobby and this office that he was going to stop managing this particular truth for this particular man. "There's a difference." Adrian looked at him. The look lasted about 3 seconds longer than comfortable. "Careful." "I know." Marcus held the look. "I'm going to be careful, and also I'm going to say it. She was asking for a Thursday dinner every week for 18 months. You were in the building every one of those Thursdays, and you didn't make it once. That's not my business, I know." Marcus set the address on the desk. "Here's where she is." He turned to go. "Marcus?" He stopped. "What did she say?" "In the note." Marcus looked at the wall for a moment. "She said she missed you. She said she thought you'd forgotten that was allowed." He left before Adrian could respond. One. Adrian did not go to Brooklyn. He stood at his office window for 40 minutes after Marcus left and looked at the Manhattan skyline, which had never once offered him anything useful, and he thought about 5 weeks. He thought about Claire moving through the penthouse in the weeks before she left, carrying her things out quietly, bag by bag, morning by morning, while he drove to Volkov Tower. He thought about what her face must have looked like doing it, and here was the problem. Here was the specific failure of the whole enterprise. He could not actually picture her face. He could not picture what Claire looked like when she was in pain, because he had not looked at her closely enough or recently enough to have that image available. He knew what she looked like at charity functions. He knew what she looked like across a conference table when she was organizing something, efficient, composed. He knew what she looked like asleep, technically, because they had shared a bed for 6 years, but he had not watched her sleep in a long time because he went to bed after her and rose before her, and the specific geography of their lives had eliminated the ordinary overlapping moments where you actually saw another person. He did not go to Brooklyn. He told himself she needed space. He told himself calling her would look like control rather than concern. And he had enough self-awareness by this point to understand that Claire's experience of being pursued by him would not resemble the movies, would not resemble anything with warmth in it, because he had given her no recent evidence that his attention meant care rather than management. He told himself he would give it a week. He lasted 4 days. He called on a Wednesday. She answered on the 4th ring, which meant she had looked at the screen and thought about it. Claire. A pause. Adrian. Her voice was even, not cold, not warm, the voice of a person who had decided something and was standing behind it without drama. "I want to talk," he said. "Okay." He waited for more. There wasn't more. "I mean, in person." "I know what you mean." "Claire, I don't think that's a good idea right now," she said. No heat, no shake. "I think we should both take some time before we're in the same room." "You left." He heard it come out harder than he intended. "You left without... You didn't say anything. You just left." "I said something." Her voice stayed even. "I wrote it down. I put it under the pie." He opened his mouth and closed it. Outside his window, a helicopter crossed the skyline from east to west, and he watched it go like it might have something to tell him. "I read the note," he said. "I know you did. It's been almost a week, and the first time you contacted me is now." She wasn't accusing. That was somehow worse. She was just reporting what had happened. the way you report weather. That told me what I needed to know. I've been trying to give you space. Adrian. She said his name with a patience that was exhausting. I've had nothing but space. I've been living in space for 3 years. That's not what I needed. He was quiet. I need to go, she said. I have somewhere to be. Where? A small pause. He heard something in the background. Voices. Distant. A child's laugh cut short by a door or a wall. I volunteer somewhere on Wednesday evenings. I have for a few months now. You never mentioned it. You never asked about my Wednesdays, she said simply, without malice. I'll talk to you when I'm ready, okay? She ended the call. He held the phone for a moment, then set it face down on the desk, which was something he used to do so the light wouldn't disturb her when she was sleeping. Marcus ran the background on the Wednesday volunteering inside of 24 hours. Not because Adrian asked him to. Adrian hadn't asked him anything directly since the conversation about the lease. But Marcus had 11 years of reading this man's silences, and he ran it because the alternative was watching Adrian Volkov make the specific category of mistake that powerful men made when they felt the ground shift and responded by trying to control the terrain. A literacy center in Carroll Gardens. She'd been going since September, 4 months, which meant she'd started before she signed the lease, before she'd started moving her things. She'd been building a life in parallel for longer than anyone had tracked. Marcus looked at the volunteer roster. Claire Hawthorne, she was using her maiden name there, he noticed, was listed as a Tuesday and Wednesday evening volunteer, adult reading program and children's after-school literacy support. The center director was a woman named Ruth Okafor. The other regular volunteers included a retired school teacher, 2 college students, and a history teacher from a middle school in Park Slope whose name was Ethan Brooks. Marcus ran Ethan Brooks the way he ran everyone who came within the orbit of people Adrian cared about. Force of habit, or professional obligation, or both. He'd stopped examining the distinction years ago. 31 years old, public school teacher 7 years. No record, no debt beyond normal. Coached junior debate on his own time. Volunteered at the Literacy Center since the previous spring, 8 months. By all accounts, and Marcus checked several, a person who was exactly what his profile suggested, a man who had chosen a life of moderate means and genuine purpose and was apparently satisfied with both. Marcus put the file on Adrian's desk without comment. Adrian read it in his office at 11 at night, alone, the desk lamp making the room feel smaller than it was. He read Ethan Brooks's file the way he read threat assessments, looking for the angle, the leverage, the hidden seam where a person's presentation broke from their reality. He didn't find one. He read it twice. Then he closed the folder and sat back and looked at the middle distance for a while. He told himself it didn't matter. She was allowed to know other people. He had no claim on how she spent her Wednesdays or her Tuesdays or any other day, now that she had removed herself from his life with 5 weeks of deliberate, quiet planning. He told himself that, and he believed it right up until the following Friday, when he had Marcus drive him to Carroll Gardens, and he sat in the back of the car down the block from the Literacy Center, and he watched the lights in the windows and the volunteers coming out in 2s and 3s at 8:30, and he saw Claire. She was standing on the sidewalk in a blue coat he didn't recognize. New, or maybe old. Maybe she'd always had it, and he'd never seen her wear it because he'd never been around on Wednesday evenings. Talking to a tall man in a gray jacket who was laughing at something she'd just said. Not performing laughter. Not the social kind. The kind that arrived without warning and left a person slightly off balance. Claire was laughing too. It was not the laugh Adrian had seen at charity functions or at dinner parties where the guests were his people, and she was the gracious accompaniment. This was the laugh she used to aim at him in the early years, when he'd said something he hadn't intended to be funny and it had caught her off guard, and the laugh that came out of her then was always surprised, like joy had startled her. He had not made her laugh that way in... He tried to think. He could not find the date. The man in the gray jacket, Adrian did not need to be told this was Ethan Brooks, touched her arm briefly, the specific touch of parting, "See you Tuesday," and then walked in the opposite direction. Claire stood for a moment on the sidewalk. She looked up at the street, at the ordinary Brooklyn evening around her, and her face in that unguarded moment was something Adrian recognized and had not seen in a very long time. She was at peace. Not happy, necessarily. Not transformed. Not healed. Just present. occupying her own life without bracing for something. Adrian sat in the back of the car and felt the thing he felt maybe 4 times in his adult life. The sensation of losing something in real time and being completely unable to stop it. The ground going out from under the part of him that had always believed he could outmaneuver any situation if he thought about it correctly and applied enough force. No rival had taken her. No enemy had moved against him in that particular space. There was no threat to neutralize, no negotiation to win, no leverage to find. He had simply, through the sustained and ordinary mechanism of not paying attention, made himself irrelevant to the life of the one person who had ever been in his corner without wanting anything from him that he didn't want to give. "Take me back," he said to the driver. He did not say anything else. Back in his office, he stood at the window for a long time. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out the 4-sentence note on the back of a grocery receipt that he had, without fully deciding to, kept since the night he found it under the pie box. He read it again. He read it the way you read something when you're finally reading it instead of registering it. 30 minutes. That's all I'm asking for. I made something from Hartley's because you mentioned it once and I remembered. I miss you. And I think you've forgotten that's allowed. He had mentioned Hartley's bakery once, 3 years ago. He didn't remember saying it, and she had carried it all that time, that small, unguarded thing he'd said about a bakery he used to walk past, and she had driven there specifically and gotten a pie and waited 53 minutes and gone upstairs anyway. And he had said he wouldn't care if she walked away. He sat down at his desk. The city below him moved through its Friday night with the indifference it brought to everything. And Adrian Volkov, who had built an empire on the principle that a man should never show the precise location of what could hurt him, put the grocery receipt note flat on the desk under his palm and pressed it there and felt, with a specificity that was almost physical, exactly what he had done. He reached for the phone, stopped, set it down. She had said she'd talk to him when she was ready. She had said it without anger, which was the most frightening version of that sentence. Anger meant residual investment. Anger meant the fire wasn't out. Even means the accounting is done. He was not a man who waited for other people's permission. He had not built anything by waiting. But he sat at his desk and he did not call, because for the first time in as long as he could trace it, he understood, not theoretically, not as a management principle, but in his body, in the tight place beneath his sternum, that he had run out of moves that belonged to him. Whatever happened next was hers to decide. And she was in Brooklyn, laughing in a blue coat he'd never seen, and becoming someone who didn't need 30 minutes of his time anymore. And he had no one to be angry at for that, except the version of himself that had stood in a conference room 8 days ago and said, without looking up from his papers, that he wouldn't care. He had been wrong. He was beginning to understand in the slow and grinding way that certain truths arrive when they've been delayed long enough, exactly how wrong he had been. He went back to the office on Saturday, not because there was anything that couldn't wait until Monday. There wasn't, or there was always something, which amounted to the same thing at this point. He went because the penthouse had started to do something to him that he didn't have a clean word for. It pressed. The rooms were the same rooms, the furniture was the same furniture, but the quality of the silence had changed in a way he felt in his back teeth, and he found he could only tolerate it in increments of a few hours before he needed the controlled noise of the tower, the phones and the footsteps, and the specific density of a building that existed entirely on his terms. He sat at his desk at 9 on a Saturday morning and looked at the grocery receipt note and then put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, which was not a decision he made so much as something his hand did while he was thinking about something else. Dominic Reyes was waiting outside his office when he arrived, which was not unusual. Dominic was Adrian's second in command and operated on approximately the same sleep schedule, which was to say a reduced and irregular one. Dominic was 42, had been with the Volkov operation for 14 years, and was one of perhaps 3 people alive who could walk into Adrian's office without knocking and survive the experience. He knocked anyway, out of what he maintained was professional courtesy, and what Adrian suspected was the specific caution of a man who had seen enough to know that certainty was expensive. "We have a problem in the Trenton pipeline," Dominic said, sitting down without being invited. "Luca's people are skimming." Adrian looked at him. "How much?" Enough to mean it's not a mistake. They've been doing it in small amounts for about 6 weeks, clean enough that it took our accountant 3 passes to catch it. 6 weeks. The same window as Claire's lease. Adrian noticed the coincidence and immediately put it aside, because the part of his brain that ran the empire did not pause for personal metaphor, and also because noticing it felt like the kind of thing a man did when he was starting to organize his whole life around a loss he hadn't admitted yet. Set a meeting with Luca, he said. Tuesday. You want to handle it yourself? I want to understand it first. Set the meeting. Dominic nodded. He did not leave immediately, which meant there was more, which Adrian had already read from the particular way Dominic had sat down. Slightly forward, weight on the front of the chair, the posture of a man with a second piece of news that was worse than the first. The Castellano alliance, Dominic said. There's a complication. Define complication. Victor Castellano's son is making noise. Marco. He was at a dinner in Hoboken Thursday night and apparently spent a significant portion of it describing our operation in terms that weren't flattering. Who was at the dinner? Dominic produced a list. Adrian read it. 3 names on the list were people he would have preferred Marco Castellano not speak in front of for reasons that were both business and political, and in 2 cases, personal. Does Victor know his son is doing this? Unknown. My guess is he knows and is letting it happen, which is its own message. Adrian set the list down. All right. That's it? All right? I heard you, Dominic. Dominic studied him for a moment with the careful attention of a man who had learned to distinguish between Adrian's various silences. This one, Adrian could tell he didn't have a category for. You look like you slept in your office, Dominic said. I slept in my office. The penthouse is fine. Adrian turned to look at the window. Handle Trenton. I'll deal with Castellano. After Dominic left, Adrian sat very still for approximately 90 seconds. Then he picked up the phone and called Marcus. I need you to do something, he said. All right. The Literacy Center in Carroll Gardens. I want to know what Claire's schedule looks like, not surveillance. I don't want someone following her. I want to know when she's there. A pause. Short, but present. Why? Because I want to know. Adrian. Marcus used his name without the title, which was something he did rarely enough that it had weight when it happened. What are you planning? Nothing that involves you. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. He stopped. Then, because Marcus deserves something closer to honesty than that, I want to see her. I'm not going to show up unannounced. I'm not going to use whatever I find to pressure her. I just want to know when she's somewhere I can... He stopped again. He didn't have the end of the sentence. Can what? Marcus asked quietly. See that she's all right. There was a longer pause this time. She's all right, Marcus said. I can tell you that for free. She's more all right than she's been in a while. That's what you're going to see if you go down there. I know, Adrian said, and you still want to go. Yes. Marcus exhaled slowly. Tuesday and Wednesday evenings, 6 to 8:30. Sometimes she stays until 9. Thank you. Don't make me regret it, Marcus said, and ended the call. The Castellano meeting happened Monday, not because Adrian had moved it up, but because Victor Castellano called Sunday evening and asked to meet, which was itself a message. Victor didn't ask, Victor proposed, and a proposal delivered on a Sunday evening was either a de-escalation or a setup, and Adrian had enough history with the man to know he needed to be in the room to determine which. They met at a restaurant in Midtown that they'd used for neutral ground conversations before, a private room in the back with one entrance and a kitchen exit that both of them knew about and neither of them mentioned. Victor Castellano was 67, silver-haired, and had the particular quality of men who had spent decades being deferred to: a settled patience, an economy of gesture, the air of someone who had learned that most problems solve themselves if you waited long enough. Marco Castellano was 34 and had not learned this yet. He was sitting at the table when Adrian arrived, which had not been part of the arrangement, and Adrian registered it without showing that he'd registered it, took a seat across from Victor, nodded at Marco once with the minimal acknowledgement that conveyed both recognition and diminishment simultaneously, and waited. I appreciate the flexibility, Victor said. Of course, Adrian said. I want to address something before we get into the quarter's arrangements. Victor folded his hands on the table in the precise way of a man who had practiced appearing unhurried. My son has opinions. I've heard. Marco shifted in his chair. He was good-looking in the aggressive way of men who'd been told so too often, a kind of permanent low-grade impatience, like he was always waiting for a room to catch up with his assessment of himself. What you've heard is that I have concerns about the current structure of our arrangement, Marco said. Which I do. Adrian looked at him without expression. Then share them. The Trenton corridor, the split is wrong. The split was negotiated with your father 14 months ago. Market conditions change. Marco leaned forward. Your operations expanded east. That expansion runs through territory we've historically managed. The current split doesn't reflect that. The split reflects the agreement we made. Marco. Victor said the name quietly. Just the name. Marco sat back, but his jaw was tight and his eyes hadn't moved. I'm saying what's true. You're saying what's premature, Victor said, still quiet. He looked at Adrian. My son's concern is noted. The arrangement stands until we renegotiate formally, which we will do at the appropriate time through the appropriate channels. He paused. I apologize for the informal communication this week. He was talking about the dinner in Hoboken. He used the phrase informal communication with the specific delicacy of a man who had spent 40 years cleaning up after people who talked when they shouldn't. Adrian looked at Marco once more. Marco held the look with the particular stubbornness of someone who'd been corrected in front of an audience and hadn't finished processing the injury. I appreciate the clarity, Adrian said to Victor. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes and resolved nothing new, which was its own kind of resolution. Walking out, Adrian felt Marco's stare on his back with the physical weight of an unfinished conversation, the kind that didn't end in a restaurant. In the car, he called Dominic. Keep eyes on Marco Castellano, he said. Not on the father, the son. Already moving that direction, Dominic said. Move faster. He went to Carroll Gardens on Tuesday. He did not plan it as carefully as he'd planned most things in his life. He told the driver to head there at 5:30, gave the address of a coffee shop 2 blocks from the Literacy Center, and sat in a corner booth with an espresso he didn't drink while he tried to think about the Castellano situation and instead thought about the blue coat. At 6:15, he walked to the block where the center was. He did not go inside. He was clear with himself about that. He stood across the street under the overhang of a dry cleaning shop and watched the lit windows of the building, a converted brownstone with a painted sign above the door that he could read from where he stood, Carroll Gardens Learning Center, open to all. Through the front windows, he could see shapes moving, the organized chaos of a room with children in it, small figures at low tables, adults bent at patient angles. At 7:20, Claire came out the front door with a woman he didn't recognize, middle-aged, carrying a tote bag overflowing with papers. They stood on the steps and talked for several minutes, and from across the street he watched Claire's face the way he'd watched it Friday from the car. This woman, who was his wife, talking to a colleague with the ease of someone who had made herself at home in a life she'd built without him. Then Ethan Brooks came out. He was taller than he'd looked in his file photo. File photos always flattened people. Something about the frontality of them. He wore the same gray jacket, or one like it. He said something to the woman with the tote bag, and she laughed and headed down the block, and then he turned to Claire and said something else. Claire tilted her head. She responded. They talked for a few minutes on the steps, and there was nothing in the conversation that looked significant. No leaning in, no charged silences, nothing that Adrian's trained eye for subtext and concealed meaning could identify as more than 2 people ending a shared evening. But Ethan Brooks looked at Claire when she spoke with the specific attention of a man who found the person in front of him interesting, and Adrian was across the street watching this with his hands in his coat pockets, and the specific misery of recognizing something he used to do and had stopped doing and only now understood was a thing that could be lost. He walked back to the coffee shop. He sat in the corner booth. He looked at the espresso. He had spent 11 years building an organization premised on the principle that the most important thing a man could protect was his position, that weakness was invitation, that vulnerability was defeat, that the moment you showed the precise location of what could hurt you, someone would use it. He had built walls that functioned. He had maintained them at cost. He had maintained them so long and so completely that they had eventually, without his noticing, extended inward as well as outward, and the man living behind them had gradually become as unreachable to his wife as he was to his enemies. He took the grocery receipt note from his jacket pocket and read it again at the corner booth of a coffee shop in Brooklyn. He was still reading it when his phone rang. It was Dominic. The call lasted 40 seconds. Marco Castellano had been to Newark that afternoon. He'd met with 3 of Luca's people, the same Luca whose operation had been skimming from the Trenton pipeline. He'd been there for 2 hours. Adrian put the phone down on the table. He looked at the note. He folded it and put it back in his pocket. He called Dominic back. "Bring Luca in tonight," he said. "Not Tuesday, tonight. It's 9 o'clock. I'm aware of the time." A pause. "All right. Where?" "The warehouse on Pier 17. And Dominic, don't announce it as a meeting." The silence on the other end lasted about 2 seconds. That was the thing about Dominic. He understood register changes. "Understood," he said. Luca Ferraro was 51, had run the Newark operation for 6 years, and was either the most straightforward man Adrian had ever employed or the best actor, a question that had never fully resolved because Adrian had never had strong reason to push it. He was thick-set, slow-moving, with a face that communicated roughly one expression in any given situation, which was the patient blankness of a man who had learned that most conversations went better when you waited to see where they were going before you contributed. He sat across from Adrian at a folding table in the Pier 17 warehouse at 9:45 with Marcus behind him and 2 of Adrian's other security people at the door, and looked at Adrian with the expression he always wore and said, "You want to tell me what this is about?" "I want you to tell me," Adrian said. "You're going to have to be more specific." "The skimming." Adrian kept his voice level. 6 weeks, small amounts, consistent intervals. "I want to know who authorized it." Luca's face did something then. Not guilt, or not only guilt. Something more complicated that moved through his eyes and was gone. "I don't know what you're... Luca." Adrian's voice dropped a register. "We've worked together for 6 years. I'm not going to insult either one of us by pretending I'm not certain. I want to know who." A long pause. Luca looked at the table surface for a moment, then back up. "It wasn't the whole operation," he said. "It was 3 guys. Who authorized them?" Another pause. This one had a different quality. A hesitation that wasn't about reluctance, but about calculation, about the specific arithmetic of what gets worse when you say it out loud. "Marco Castellano came to me 8 weeks ago," Luca said. "He said the arrangement with your organization was being renegotiated. He said some funds needed to move ahead of the formal agreement to establish the new terms." The room was very quiet. "He said it came from you," Luca said. "He said you were restructuring the alliance, and you needed liquidity moved quietly while the paperwork caught up." Adrian was still. Completely still. The kind of still that in another man would look like calm, and in Adrian Volkov, to anyone who knew him, looked like the moment before something became irreversible. "He said it came from me," Adrian repeated. "He used your name. He had details about the Trenton split that I thought only you and Victor..." Luca stopped. His jaw worked. "I should have verified it." "Yes," Adrian said. "You should have. I understand if you will write down everything, every conversation, every amount, every person present. You will do that tonight, here, and you will give it to Marcus." Adrian stood. "And then you will go home, and you will stay there until I contact you." Luca nodded. His face had the look of a man who had just understood the size of the thing he'd been standing next to without seeing it. Adrian walked to the far end of the warehouse and stood with his back to the room for a moment. The river was on the other side of the wall, and he could hear it faintly, the water moving with its own indifferent momentum. Marco Castellano had used his name, had walked into his operation with the specific audacity of someone who believed he wouldn't be checked, or more precisely, of someone who wanted to be found out eventually, wanted the discovery to happen at a moment of his choosing, as the opening move of a confrontation he'd been building toward. The meeting on Monday had been theater. Victor's informal communication and his careful apology, Possibly genuine, possibly the cover story of a man who knew what his son was doing and had calculated that plausible distance was more useful than complicity. Adrian didn't know yet. He needed to know. He turned around. Marcus was watching him from across the warehouse with the expression of a man who had processed the same information and arrived at the same place. "Victor or not?" Marcus asked. "I don't know yet." "Best guess?" Adrian considered it honestly. Victor is 67 and has never moved recklessly in his life. Marco is 34 and thinks impatience is the same as strategy. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Best guess is Victor knows but didn't direct it, which is its own problem. Because it means he let it happen. Because it means he let it happen and then sat across a table from me on Monday and apologized for his son's informal communication. Adrian buttoned his jacket with the precise movements of someone controlling something with their hands because there was nothing else available to control at the moment. Which means either he was testing how long it took me to find it, or he was hoping I wouldn't. What do we do? Adrian thought of Marco Castellano's jaw, tight across the restaurant table. The particular stubbornness of a man who'd been corrected in public and wasn't done with it. The Hoboken dinner, the Newark meeting. The money moved through Luca's people in amounts small enough to look like errors but consistent enough to be a message. I can reach into your operation and you won't see it coming. Except he had seen it. Not because he was looking, he hadn't been looking. He'd been sitting in a coffee shop in Brooklyn reading a note on a grocery receipt. But because Marcus had been looking and Dominic had been looking, and the infrastructure of 11 years of building something that didn't break was still functioning, even when the man at the center of it was thinking about a blue coat in a bakery on West 74th. "We don't move on Marco until we know about Victor," Adrian said. "That's the first thing. I need to know if the father is behind the son or behind the son." Marcus frowned. "What's the difference?" "Behind the son means he supports it, but let Marco run it so there's distance. Behind the son means he's standing clear of it, watching to see if it collapses on its own." Adrian walked toward the door. "One of those is a betrayal. The other is a father who hasn't figured out yet that he has a problem." "And if it's the betrayal?" Adrian stopped at the door. He looked at the river through a high, grimy window. The dark water and the lights of the opposite shore, the city going on. He thought about Claire in the blue coat. He thought about Ethan Brooks looking at her when she spoke. He thought about the specific damage that came from not paying attention. From believing the things that mattered would remain available indefinitely, from treating permanence as a default rather than something that required maintenance, required presence, required the basic acknowledgement that what you had was something that could be lost. He had done that with his marriage for 6 years, and it had cost him the one person in his life who had asked for nothing except to matter. He was not going to make the same calculation twice. "If it's the betrayal," he said, "then everything changes." He pushed open the warehouse door and walked out into the November cold, and the river smell hit him, and somewhere across that water was Brooklyn, and a woman in a blue coat was getting home from a literacy center and probably making tea or reading or doing whatever a person did when they had reclaimed enough of their own life to have evenings that belonged entirely to them. He got in the car. "The penthouse," he told the driver. He sat in the back and looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had built something enormous and maintained it through force and intelligence and the absolute refusal to show weakness. And they were, at this moment, at 9:58 on a Tuesday night, the hands of a man who was beginning to understand that the greatest structural flaw in everything he'd built was that he had built it at the cost of the only part of his life that had ever been real. The Castellano situation would require a response. Luca would write his account and Marcus would verify it, and Dominic would prepare the necessary preparations for whatever came next. The Empire would handle the Empire. But something else was also happening. In the slower and less legible part of him where decisions formed before they became decisions, something that had started the moment he'd read a 4-sentence note on a grocery receipt and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, exactly what he had thrown away. He was going to have to become someone different. Not for her, or not only for her. For the reason she had once believed in him, back when there was something in him worth believing in, back before the Empire had consumed everything, including the man who'd built it. He did not know if it was too late. He suspected it might be. He was going to find out anyway. Luca's written account ran to 11 pages. Marcus brought it to Adrian at 6 in the morning, still warm from the printer, and Adrian read it standing at the kitchen island in the penthouse with a coffee he kept forgetting to drink. The handwriting was Luca's. They'd asked him to write it by hand, deliberately, so there would be no question later about editing or reconstruction. 11 pages of the particular penmanship of a man who'd grown up in a time when you wrote things with your body, not a keyboard. Slanted, dense, occasionally crossed out and rewritten. Luca had met with Marco Castellano 4 times over 8 weeks. The first meeting had been framed as a courtesy introduction, Marco presenting himself as the next-generation contact in the Castellano operation, someone Luca should know as the alliance evolved. The second meeting had introduced the idea of the fund movement, framed as a structural adjustment Adrian had approved. By the third meeting, Luca had his 3 men moving money in the precise increments that would read as rounding errors across 3 separate accounts. By the fourth meeting, Marco had brought a man Luca didn't recognize who had sat quietly in the corner and said nothing, and whose presence Luca had found, in retrospect, significant enough to mention. He described the man in the corner in 2 sentences: heavy-set, late 40s, with a scar along the left jawline, and the specific quality of stillness that Luca associated with men who were paid specifically for what they did with their hands. Adrian read those 2 sentences 3 times. Then he took a photo of the page and sent it to Marcus. He texted one word: who? Marcus called back in 4 minutes. I think it's a man named Carver, Thomas Carver. He's not affiliated with the Castellanos directly. He's independent. But he's been used by 2 other families in the past 18 months for specific contract work. What kind? The kind that ends things, Marcus said. Permanently. Adrian set the coffee down. Marco brought a contractor to a meeting with Luca. 8 weeks ago. Before the Hoboken dinner. Before Monday's meeting. Adrian looked at the window. The November morning was gray and flat and offered nothing. This wasn't about money, he said. No, Marcus said. It wasn't. Pochetta. He called Dominic at 6:15. Dominic arrived at the penthouse at 6:45, which meant he'd been already moving before the call, which meant Marcus had already called him, which meant the 2 of them had been talking about this before they brought it to Adrian, and under any other circumstances that kind of parallel communication would have bothered him. Today, it didn't. Today it meant the people around him had been paying attention when he hadn't been, and he was going to have to find a way to acknowledge that which didn't involve him becoming someone he wasn't. Tell me what you think, Adrian said when Dominic was sitting across from him. Dominic had the file Marcus had assembled on Thomas Carver open on his phone. He set the phone face down on the table, which meant he'd already processed what he needed from it. Marco Castellano came into your operation 8 weeks ago using your name and moved money through Luca's people in a way that left a traceable thread. That thread leads back to you, not to Marco. On paper, Luca's operation diverted funds under the authorization of the Volkov organization. He paused. If something happened to you in the next month, those accounts tell a story about internal skimming and mismanagement. Your people, your authorization. Marco's name is nowhere. Clean exit strategy, Adrian said. Clean origin story, Dominic said, for whoever comes in after. The sentence sat in the room for a moment. Victor? Adrian asked. I don't think Victor knows about Carver. Dominic picked up the phone again, looked at something, set it back down. I think Victor knows about the money. I think he looked the other way on the Hoboken dinner. But Carver is a different category. If Victor sanctioned a contractor... He stopped. Victor's 67 and he's survived this long by being precise. Using a contractor against an allied organization is the kind of thing that starts a war he can't win. He's not stupid enough. Marco thinks he is, Adrian said. Marco thinks he's 3 steps ahead of everyone. That's the most dangerous kind of wrong. Adrian stood and walked to the window with his hands in his pockets. Below, the city was beginning its morning in the specific incremental way it always did. First the delivery trucks, then the dog walkers, then the earliest of the office workers, each category of person occupying their designated slot in the daily architecture of a city that moved whether or not you were paying attention. Where's Carver now? He said. That's the part I don't love, Dominic said. We lost him Thursday. Adrian turned. Say that again? He was in Hoboken Tuesday. We picked up his trail Wednesday morning. Thursday, he dropped off everything, phone, cards, all of it. The silence in the penthouse was the kind that had weight. He's already in the city, Adrian said. It wasn't a question. That's my read. Adrian looked at Marcus, who had been standing by the door with his arms at his sides, and the expression of a man who had already done the math and didn't like the answer. Security rotation, Adrian said. Doubled last night, Marcus said, when Dominic told me about Carver. The tower. Covered. Your regular entry points are being varied. Car rotation starts today. Marcus paused. And I've asked 2 people to keep eyes on the Carroll Gardens building. Adrian looked at him. She's your wife, Marcus said simply. Until she isn't, she's a potential pressure point. The thing that moved across Adrian's chest at that, the specific and visceral objection to Claire being anywhere in the proximity of this, was something he kept off his face with the practice of 20 years, but his hands, inside his coat pockets, closed into fists. She doesn't know anything about any of this, he said. Doesn't matter what she knows. He was right. Adrian knew he was right. A contractor who'd gone dark in a city he was already in didn't need the target to have told his wife anything. He needed leverage points. He needed angles. 2 people isn't enough on the Carroll Gardens building, Adrian said. 4 then. And she can't know they're there. She won't. He called Victor Castellano at 8 in the morning and asked for a meeting that day. Victor's assistant said Mr. Castellano was unavailable until Wednesday. Adrian called Victor's personal cell, which he had and had never used because using it communicated urgency, and urgency was information. Victor picked up on the second ring. Adrian, I need to see you today, Victor. A pause. The careful pause of a careful man. My schedule, today, Adrian said. Not Wednesday. It's not a request. Another pause. Longer. 4 o'clock, Victor said. The usual place. Somewhere else. I'll send you an address. He ended the call. He looked at Dominic. Set a location, not anywhere we've used before. I want it controllable, and I want it ours. Dominic was already on his phone. Adrian went to his bedroom and changed his jacket. He stood in front of the closet for a moment. His side of the closet, which remained intact, fully stocked, every suit and shirt in its designated position the way everything in his professional life was designated and positioned. Then he looked at the other side, the dresses and the winter coat with the broken zipper, and he thought about Claire in a Brooklyn apartment on a mattress without a bed frame, building something from nothing while he stood here with 11 pages of handwritten betrayal sitting on his kitchen island. He closed the closet and went back to work. The afternoon moved fast in the specific way of days with too many things in them. Dominic arranged a location, a private dining room above a restaurant on Varick Street, whose owner owed Adrian a favor significant enough that the man had never once asked for anything in return. Marcus ran a secondary security check on all entry and exit points. Luca called at noon from home and said one of the 3 men from his operation had not reported in that morning, which introduced a new variable that Adrian absorbed without visible reaction and then immediately began moving resources around. They found the man, Danny Rourke, 33, 4 years in the Newark group, at 2 o'clock. He was fine. He'd gone to his mother's house in Queens because he was frightened, which was a reasonable response to having participated in a criminal diversion scheme under false authorization and then watching his boss get quietly summoned to a warehouse meeting on short notice. Marcus spoke to Danny Rourke in his mother's Queens kitchen and communicated that he should stay there, that staying there was in his significant interest, and that Adrian Volkov's organizational memory was long but not infinite, and acts of cooperative stupidity were remembered differently from acts of deliberate betrayal. Danny Rourke said he understood. He looked like he meant it. At 3:45, Adrian's car stopped outside the Varick Street restaurant. Marcus swept the room twice before Adrian went up. Dominic was already inside. 2 of Adrian's security people were at the door. Victor Castellano arrived at 4:03 with his own 2 security people, whom Marcus met at the entrance with a conversation that was professionally courteous and resulted in them remaining downstairs. Victor came up alone, which meant he'd made a calculation about this meeting that Adrian found interesting. Victor sat down across from him. He looked at the room, the layout, the exits, the positions of Dominic and Marcus, with the experienced eyes of a man reading terrain. "You've been busy," Victor said. "Sit down, Victor." Victor sat. He folded his hands on the table in the same way he had Monday at the restaurant, the patience of a man who believed he could wait anything out. "Marco," Adrian said. Victor's face didn't change. "What about him?" "He came into my operation 8 weeks ago using my name. He moved money through my people in a way that puts the liability on my organization. And he brought a man named Thomas Carver to his 4th meeting with my Newark contact." The name landed. Adrian watched Victor's face when it did, watched the small, precise movement in the muscles around his eyes that a less observant person might have missed entirely. Victor knew the name. "I don't know what Marco—" he started. "Victor." Adrian kept his voice level. "We have known each other for 9 years. I've been in rooms with you where things were said that could have ended both of us, and neither of us moved on the other because we were smart enough to understand that the alliance was worth more than the advantage. I'm asking you to be that smart right now." A long silence. Victor looked at the table. Then he looked up. His face had done something. The patience had shifted, replaced by something older and, Adrian thought, more tired. "I knew about the money," Victor said. "I didn't know about Carver." "You looked the other way on the money." "I let Marco run something he thought was his idea." Victor's jaw moved. "I underestimated how far he'd take it." "A contractor, Victor. Your son brought a contractor into a meeting with my people while using my name. Do you understand what that means if something happens to me in the next 30 days? Every thread leads back to an internal failure in my organization. Marco's name is clean. Yours is clean." He stopped. "Was that the plan? Or did your son go further than you knew?" Victor was quiet for a long time, long enough that Marcus shifted his weight slightly by the door, a micro-adjustment that meant he was recalibrating. "Marco believes the organization needs new leadership," Victor said finally. His voice was flat and old and had something in it that might, in another kind of man, have been grief. "He believes I've been too conservative. He believes the alliance with your operation has limited our growth." "And you?" "I believe," Victor said carefully, "that my son is 34 years old and has never lost anything." The sentence fell between them like something heavy. "Where is he now?" Adrian said. "I don't know. That's not acceptable." "I know it's not." Victor looked directly at him for the first time since sitting down. "Adrian, I will find out where Carver is. I will call him off. I will handle Marco." "How?" "That's my business. When a contractor your son hired is somewhere in this city, and I don't know where, everything is my business." Victor put his hands flat on the table. "Give me 24 hours. Adrian looked at him. At the hands flat on the table, the gesture of a man offering himself as a guarantee, the oldest kind of bond in the world they both inhabited. 18, Adrian said. Victor nodded. He stood. He picked up his jacket with the movements of a man who was carrying something that had just gotten substantially heavier. At the door he stopped. Without turning, "I didn't know about Carver, Adrian." "I believe you," Adrian said. "That's the only reason you walked out of this room." Victor left. Dominic exhaled slowly from the corner. "You believe him?" "About Carver, yes." Adrian stood, buttoned his jacket. "About not knowing his son was going to get here, I'm not sure he didn't know and simply didn't stop it." "What's the difference at this point?" "The difference is what comes after." Adrian picked up his phone. A father who didn't see it is manageable. A father who looked away is a different conversation. He looked at Dominic. "I want eyes on every Castellano property in the metro area. I want to know when Marco moves. And if Victor finds him first, then Victor and I will have a different conversation about what it means to handle something." He was in the car at 6:15 heading back to the tower when Marcus called. "The man on the Carroll Gardens building," Marcus said. "He called in 10 minutes ago. Claire left the center at 5:45. She wasn't scheduled to be in today." Adrian's chest tightened. "Where is she now?" "Home. Brooklyn apartment. She's inside." "Why did she leave early?" We don't know. She came out the front door, stood on the steps for about 2 minutes, then walked home faster than her usual pace. A brief pause. She might have noticed one of mine. Or someone else's, Adrian said. The silence on the line was exactly 2 seconds. Get a second person inside the building, Adrian said. I'm coming. Adrian, I'm coming. He told the driver Carroll Gardens and felt the car adjust course, felt the city reorganize around the new direction, and sat forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands together and breathed through the constriction in his chest that he recognized as something he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever, in quite this specific form. Not fear of dying, which he'd made peace with as a professional consideration a long time ago, but fear of Claire, alone in a Brooklyn apartment, being anywhere near the consequences of a life she had removed herself from with 5 weeks of quiet planning and not a single word of accusation. The car crossed the bridge at 6:28. He watched the lights of the city behind him and forward of him and thought about Marco Castellano somewhere in those lights, 34, and convinced of his own position, holding a strategy that required a contractor and a dead man, and was now coming apart at the seams because he'd underestimated the infrastructure of what he'd moved against. He thought about Carver. The stillness of men paid for specific things, the specificity of what those things were. He thought about Claire walking home faster than her usual pace. The car stopped on her block at 6:37. He got out without waiting for Marcus, who was 30 seconds behind him in a second vehicle, and walked to the building entrance and pressed the buzzer for her apartment with the specific and unfamiliar sensation of being a man who no longer had any right to be here and was here anyway. Because the alternative was sitting in a car, knowing she was alone and possibly frightened and believing it was none of his business. Static. Then her voice through the intercom, cautious. Who is it? It's me, he said. He didn't say Adrian. He said me because in 6 years of marriage, me had always meant him. And old habits were structural. A long pause. So long he thought she was going to leave him at the door. The buzzer sounded. He went up 3 flights. Her door was open an inch when he reached the landing. Not fully open, not closed. He pushed it and stepped in. The apartment was small and warm and smelled like wood floors and the specific kind of tea she'd been drinking since before he knew her. There was more in it now than he'd imagined from Marcus's description. A small bookshelf assembled crookedly against the far wall, the stacked boxes of books with perhaps a third of them unpacked, a folding table with 2 chairs, the mattress now with an actual frame, a lamp with a yellow shade that made the light look different from any light in the penthouse, softer, the kind of light that existed in rooms where people actually lived. Claire was standing in the kitchen area, a counter, a 2-burner stove, the kettle already on. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweater he recognized from years back, one of his, actually, something that had migrated to her side of the closet and become hers by occupation. Her hair was pulled back. She looked in the specific way of people who have recently been frightened, like she was holding herself very carefully. You buzzed me in, he said. I know I did. She looked at him. Her face was doing the controlled thing, the thing she did when she had decided to be composed and was succeeding at a cost. There was a man outside my building this morning. And a different one this evening. They're mine, he said. They're there to... I know they're yours, she said. That's why I buzzed you in, because if your people are outside my building, I want to know why. He stood in her apartment with his coat still on and looked at his wife and felt the full weight of what he was about to tell her. Not the details, not the operational specifics she didn't need and he wouldn't give her, but the shape of it, the fact of it, the truth that his world had sent something in her direction without her consent or knowledge. There's a situation, he said. It doesn't involve you directly, but someone may be using pressure points, and I needed to know you were... He stopped. I needed to know. A pressure point, she repeated. Her voice was even. That's what I am. That's not... He exhaled. No, that's not what I said. You said someone may use pressure points. I'm the only person you've put security on, Adrian. I'm not a part of your world anymore. I left, which means the only reason I qualify as a pressure point is because whoever this is knows that you... She stopped herself. The kettle began to sound. She turned and took it off the burner and poured water into a mug with the practiced efficiency of a woman managing a situation with her hands because it was better than managing it with her voice. Knows that you'd respond, she finished quietly, without looking at him. He didn't say anything. She set the kettle down. Her back was to him. Are you in danger? I'm handling it. That's not what I asked. Claire, are you in danger? She turned now, mug in both hands, and looked at him directly. Her eyes were clear and dark and contained something he recognized as the specific courage of a woman who has been through enough that she no longer has the luxury of softening her questions. There's a contractor, he said. We believe he's in the city. We don't know where yet. We're moving on it. She absorbed this, the way she absorbed things, goes very still, very internal, no visible reaction while the information settled into her. How long? She said. We'll have a location within 18 hours. Victor Castellano. I don't need the names. She shook her head once. How long have you known? Since last night. And you came here at... She glanced at the window, the dark outside. 6:30, because you left the center early and you walked home faster than usual, and Marcus said you might have noticed one of his people, and I needed to know you were inside and all right. He heard himself say it, and it was true. And it was not the whole truth. Because the whole truth was that he had been in that car crossing the bridge with his hands together and something close to panic in his chest that he did not have a category for in 11 years of running an organization that required him to have a category for everything. She looked at him for a long time. He had the uncomfortable sensation of being read, of her eyes doing the same thing his did in rooms where he needed to understand the situation, going through the surface of things to what was underneath. Sit down, Adrian, she said finally. He sat. She didn't sit across from him. She stayed by the kitchen counter, mug in both hands, and looked at him from that position with the careful distance of someone who is choosing how close to stand to a fire. Tell me what I need to do, she said. Practically, not the details. Just what I need to do to be safe until this is resolved. He told her. Stay in the building when possible. Use the back entrance. Don't vary her schedule in ways that would create predictable empty periods. His people would be outside, just 2 of them, day and night, and she wouldn't see them most of the time, but they'd be there. She nodded at each point with the specific efficiency of a woman who had organized her life around the absence of this exact kind of conversation and was now having it anyway. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then, when this is over, yes. I want you to remove the security, all of it. I want my life back. I know. I mean it. I know you mean it. He looked at her. I'm not going to use this as a reason to stay in your life, Claire. I came here tonight because you were in potential danger, and it's my fault, and I needed to see that you were... He stopped again for the same reason he always stopped now when he tried to finish these sentences, which was that the end of them was true in a way that felt exposed in a way he didn't know what to do with. That you were all right, he said. She looked at him with those clear, dark eyes, and something moved through them. Something that was not forgiveness and not warmth, not yet, but was something adjacent to those things, something in the same family. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of a woman seeing a man be truthful after a long drought of it. You should go, she said. He stood. He buttoned his coat. He looked at the crooked bookshelf and the yellow lamp and the 2 chairs at the folding table and the apartment that was entirely hers, built entirely by her, and he felt the specific ache of a man standing in a life he didn't get to have because he'd spent the years it was available to him looking somewhere else. I'm sorry, he said. Not about tonight. For everything before tonight. She didn't respond to that. He hadn't expected her to. He went to the door. Adrian, he stopped. Be careful, she said. Not tenderly, not warmly, but the words were real and she had chosen to say them, and he understood that was its own kind of thing. That a woman who had decided to leave could still mean be careful and it not be a contradiction. I will, he said. He went downstairs and out into the November cold and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. Marcus was leaning against the second car watching him. She okay? She's okay. Adrian looked up the street. Any movement on Carver? Nothing yet. He nodded. He got in the car. His phone rang as the door closed. Dominic, voice tight in the way it got when information was arriving faster than structure could contain it. "We found Marco," Dominic said. "He's at a property in Red Hook. He's not alone." "Who's with him?" "We're counting 4 people. And Adrian," a pause, the specific pause of a man deciding whether to lead with the worst part. Carver's cars parked outside. The city moved past the car windows, indifferent as always, and Adrian Volkov looked at the dark water of the harbor visible between buildings and felt everything compress into the specific cold clarity that arrived when all the preliminary positioning was done and what remained was the thing itself. "Red Hook," he said. Red Hook at night had a particular quality that other parts of the city didn't. The way the water smell came off the harbor and mixed with diesel and cold air, and the specific industrial silence of blocks where nothing was open and nobody was supposed to be. Adrian's car stopped 2 streets over from the property Dominic had identified. Not a warehouse exactly, a converted machine shop, one of the last ones in the neighborhood that hadn't been turned into condominiums or brewery tap rooms, sitting at the end of a short block with chain link on 3 sides and a loading dock facing the water. The kind of building that appeared on no one's radar because it generated no traffic, no noise, no reason for anyone to look at it twice. Marcus was already there. He'd taken a different route, arrived 4 minutes ahead, and was standing at the corner of the adjacent block when Adrian got out of the car, his breath visible in the November air, his posture carrying the specific controlled tension of a man who had assessed a situation and found it worse than anticipated. 4 people inside plus Carver, Marcus said quietly. 2 on the loading dock, but they're not hiding them, which is either confidence or stupidity. With Marco, it could be both, Dominic said. He'd arrived in a 3rd vehicle and came up from the opposite direction, moving with the unhurried precision of a man who had done versions of this before. "We have 6 people positioned. I can have 4 more here in 12 minutes. Adrian looked at the building. The lights inside were the low industrial kind, visible through the high windows as a yellow-gray glow that suggested work lights rather than overheads. A generator was running somewhere. He could feel it in his back teeth before he could properly hear it. "What's the play?" Marcus asked. It was the right question, and there were 2 answers to it. The first answer was the one that belonged to the version of Adrian Volkov, who had built 11 years of organization on the principle that a threat neutralized completely was a threat that could not recalibrate. 4 people and a contractor, a contained location, a night with no witnesses, and a waterfront that had absorbed difficult things before and would again. The second answer was the one that had been forming since a Tuesday night at a coffee shop in Brooklyn when he'd read a grocery receipt note for the 3rd time and understood, with the precision of a man who was good at understanding things too late, what he'd allowed himself to become. He thought about Claire's voice through the intercom. "Who is it?" The specific caution of a woman who had put herself back together in a small apartment and was not prepared to have the demolished version of her life follow her there. "Be careful." She had said it without tenderness, and she had meant it. "I want Marco alive," Adrian said. Marcus looked at him. "Adrian, alive, Marcus. The rest is contingent on what they do." He turned to Dominic. "Get the 4 additional people. Position them at the water side. If anyone tries to go out the loading dock, I want it covered. And Carver. Carver is a contractor. Contractors make calculations. When the calculation changes, so does the contract." He pulled his jacket collar up against the cold. "I'm going to give him the opportunity to make a different one." Dominic and Marcus exchanged a glance that lasted about 1 second. It communicated approximately 7 things, most of which Adrian registered and set aside. They had been with him long enough to understand that when he made a decision like this, the decision was made. 12 minutes, Dominic said, and pulled out his phone. They moved into position. The approach to the building took 6 minutes of careful movement through the dark, hugging the chain link, crossing a patch of broken asphalt that had to be navigated without sound, coming around to the north face of the building where a secondary entrance gave way to a short corridor before opening into the main floor. Marcus went first. The door was unlocked, which told Adrian that either Marco's people were careless or they'd been expecting the possibility of visitors and decided confidence looked better than caution. The corridor smelled like machine oil and old concrete and something metallic that Adrian didn't try to identify. Marcus moved through it with his hand up. 4 fingers, meaning 4 individuals located. Then 3 fingers pointed left, 1 right. Adrian came in behind him with 2 of their people at the rear. What he saw when the corridor opened into the main floor was Marco Castellano sitting at a folding table with a lamp on it, a bottle of something amber-colored with 2 glasses poured, and the specific posture of a man who had been waiting and was irritated that the waiting had taken this long. Carver was standing against the far wall. The 2 men from the loading dock were behind Marco, standing the way men stood when they'd been told to stand there and look significant. Marco looked at Adrian when he came through into the light, and his face did something complex. Surprise first, then the rapid suppression of surprise, then the specific expression of a man deciding in real time whether what had just happened was a setback or could be repositioned as something else. "Well," Marco said. "Marco," Adrian said, "you found us faster than I expected." He looked at Marcus, at the 2 men behind Adrian. He did the arithmetic and his jaw moved slightly. "How many outside?" "Enough," Adrian said. Marco looked at Carver. Carver hadn't moved from the wall. He was exactly what Luca's 2 sentences had described. Heavy-set, late 40s, the scar along the left jawline, and the absolute stillness of a man who was not afraid and was also not doing anything until the situation resolved into a clear direction. His eyes moved from Adrian to the entrances and back in the unhurried way of someone conducting a professional assessment rather than a personal one. Adrian looked directly at Carver. "Mr. Carver?" Carver looked at him without expression. "I'm going to have a conversation with this man. When it's over, I'd like to have a separate conversation with you about the current terms of your engagement and whether they still make sense given the present situation." He held Carver's eyes for another moment. "I'd appreciate it if you'd wait." Carver was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "I'll wait," in the flat tone of someone stating a logistical position rather than granting a favor, and he crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall. Marco's eyes went from Carver to Adrian with the expression of a man watching something he'd built come apart at a specific seam. "You can't just sit down, Marco," Adrian said. "I'm already sitting." "Then stay there." He walked to the table and stood across from it and looked at the amber bottle and the 2 glasses poured and thought about what that represented. Marco had expected a conversation tonight, had staged it, had either expected Adrian to come himself or had prepared for a different kind of visitor, and Adrian could not entirely tell which. "Your father doesn't know you brought Carver in." Marco's expression shifted. "My father told me today he didn't know. I believed him. I'm less certain now." He let that sit. "Did you tell him?" "My father has spent 20 years being cautious," Marco said, and the word cautious came out of him with a contempt that had been marinating for a long time. "You know what caution gets you? The same territory, the same split, the same arrangement with the same people going nowhere while every other family has expanded. Your father has been alive for 20 years in this business," Adrian said, "which is not nothing. It's not enough. It's everything." Adrian looked at him. "You're 34. You think longevity is a consolation prize. I think it's a ceiling." And Carver was supposed to remove the ceiling. Marco said nothing. His jaw was tight, and his hands were flat on the table, and he had the look of a man who had rehearsed a version of this conversation in which he had more leverage than he currently had, and was now doing the painful work of adjusting in real time. "Here's what you built," Adrian said. "You came into my operation with my name. You moved money in a way that traces back to my organization, not yours. You brought in a contractor without your father's knowledge and staged it so that if something happened to me, the story told by the paper trail is internal mismanagement at the Volkov organization. The Castellano name stays clean. You step into the vacuum. The alliance restructures on your terms because you're the only one left standing who knows where the bodies are, figuratively speaking." He paused. "Is that the architecture?" Marco's silence was confirmation enough. "It's a good plan," Adrian said. "The skimming was clean. The false authorization was clean. Carver going dark was timed well." He straightened slightly. "The problem is you moved against someone who had 11 years of infrastructure in place and people who pay attention even when their employer is distracted." Marco looked at the table. Something moved across his face. Not remorse, not quite, but the specific and unwilling recognition of a man confronting the gap between what he'd believed about a situation and what the situation actually was. "What happens now?" Marco said. "That depends on your father," Adrian said. Marco looked up. "My father. I'm going to call him. I'm going to tell him where we are and what I found and what you built." Adrian watched Marco's face. "And then I'm going to let Victor Castellano decide what happens to his son." Something went through Marco's eyes at that. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that looked like the specific vertigo of a man who had underestimated the one variable he should have weighted most heavily. Marco stopped. "He'll what?" Adrian said. Marco's jaw worked. He looked away. And in that look away, in the exact angle of his face and the tight set of his mouth, Adrian saw something he hadn't expected to see. Not defiance, but something younger, something that predated all of this. A 34-year-old man who had maneuvered his way into the corner of a room with no door and was beginning to understand it. Adrian called Victor. "All right." Victor Castellano arrived at the Red Hook building at 11:45. He came alone, which was either trust or theater, and when he walked through the north entrance and into the light and saw his son at the folding table, his face did the one thing Adrian had never seen it do in 9 years of knowing him. It broke. Just for a second. Just in the eyes, the specific fracture of a man looking at the consequence of something he'd let go too far, something he'd watched developing and told himself he could manage and then discovered in the most unmanageable way possible, that he couldn't. He sat down at the table across from Marco. Adrian stepped back. This was not his conversation to run. He understood that with a clarity that surprised him, the clarity of a man who had been in enough rooms to know the difference between the situations that were his and the situations that belonged to other people's specific accountings. He walked to where Carver was still standing against the far wall. Carver watched him approach without moving. "The man who hired you is having a conversation with his father," Adrian said quietly. "How that conversation ends will determine whether the contract is still viable. Contracts end when clients end them or when I end them," Carver said. His voice was low and had the quality of something that had been stripped down to function. No warmth, no effect, nothing extra. "I understand that. I'm not asking you to break anything. I'm asking you to wait for the conversation to finish." "I've been waiting. I know. I'm asking you to keep waiting." Carver looked at him with the eyes of a man running calculations that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with probability. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Marco described you as someone who managed by distance, someone who'd been distracted." He said the last word without emphasis, the way a professional said things that weren't judgments, just data. Adrian felt the word land in the specific place it was aimed. "He wasn't wrong," he said. "About the distracted part." Carver said nothing. "I'm less distracted now," Adrian said. Carver looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at Marco and Victor at the table. The father's voice low, the son's head down, the specific hunched posture of someone receiving a reckoning they have no argument against. "When the conversation's done," Carver said, "we'll talk." Adrian walked to the far side of the room and stood near the waterside wall and waited. He could hear Victor's voice in fragments. Not the words, the register. Low and controlled, and underneath the control, something that had weight to it. The weight of a father and a son in a room where what should have been said years ago was finally being said in the worst possible setting and at the worst possible cost. Marco's voice came in shorter fragments. At one point he said something that made Victor stop entirely, a full stop that lasted several seconds, and then Victor's voice dropped lower still, almost below what Adrian could detect. Dominic appeared at Adrian's shoulder. "Outside is clean," he said. "Your people have it." "Good. What's the call on Marco when this is done?" Adrian watched the two figures at the table. Victor makes the call on Marco. Dominic was quiet for a moment. "That's a change." "It's his son," Adrian said. "It's your life that was—" "I know what it was." He looked at Dominic. "We're not starting a war with the Castellano family over a 34-year-old who got ahead of himself and ran a plan that didn't work. Victor will handle it. The message will be clear enough. And if it isn't?" Then we have that conversation later. With evidence, with leverage, with the full record that Luca wrote in his mother's handwriting across 11 pages. He turned back to the table. But that's not where we are tonight. The conversation between Victor and Marco lasted 31 minutes. When it ended, Victor stood and buttoned his jacket and looked across the room at Adrian with the expression of a man who had just paid something he couldn't get back. He walked to where Adrian stood. "The Trenton accounts," Victor said. "Every dollar that moved will be returned. With interest. I'll handle it personally." Adrian nodded. "Marco will not be in contact with any part of your organization going forward." Victor paused. "He will not be in contact with much of anything going forward." The sentence had a finality to it that Adrian didn't push on. The shape of what Victor intended was clear enough, and what it meant for the Castellano family's internal arrangements was Victor's to carry. "The alliance," Adrian said. Victor looked at him directly. "If you want it." 9 years is something, Adrian said. "I don't throw away something because one person tried to take what they hadn't earned." Something moved across Victor's face. Not gratitude exactly, but something in that direction. The acknowledgement of a man who had been offered more than he expected after delivering less than he should have. "I'll be in touch about the formal restructuring," Victor said, "through appropriate channels." "Of course." Victor looked at his son once more. Marco still at the table, not looking at either of them. And then he walked out of the building. Adrian crossed to Carver. "The client just significantly changed shape," he said. Carver had watched the whole thing without expression. "I noticed. The contract as originally structured doesn't have a viable client anymore." "No." "I'd like to formalize that," Adrian said. "In whatever way makes sense." Carver looked at him with the specific assessment of someone deciding how much of what he actually thought to put into a sentence. "The way this works," he said, "is that contracts are with clients, not targets. When the client changes the contract changes. And Victor's call on Marco means the original structure is dissolved." Carver uncrossed his arms. "I have no outstanding obligation. I appreciate the clarity. I'd appreciate not seeing the inside of this building again." "That can be arranged," Adrian said. Carver walked to the north entrance and out through the corridor and into the November night. And Adrian listened to his footsteps on the concrete until they stopped. And then there was only the sound of the generator and the distant harbor water. Marco was still at the table. Adrian walked over and stood at the edge of it. Marco looked up at him with the eyes of a man who had been comprehensively defeated and was doing the painful, necessary work of sitting inside that fact without anywhere to redirect it. "Your father loves you," Adrian said, in case that was unclear from the last 30 minutes. Marco said nothing. "That's the only reason you're sitting at this table instead of at the bottom of the harbor." He said it without heat, factually. "I want you to understand that." "I understand it," Marco said. His voice was rough. Something had gone out of it. The impatience, the barely suppressed contempt that had been in every syllable at the Midtown restaurant on Monday. "Good." Adrian straightened. "I'm going to remember this. Not to use it. But I'm going to remember it, and I want you to know that. Because the kind of man who forgets this kind of thing is the kind of man who ends up in a room like this again." He turned to go. "Volkov." He stopped. "I thought you were—" Marco stopped. Started again. "I thought you were the kind of man who'd already stopped caring about the things worth caring about." His voice was unsteady in a way it hadn't been all night. "I thought you were distracted. Soft." He looked at the table. "That's why I thought it would work." Adrian stood there for a moment. He thought about a note on a grocery receipt, about 53 minutes in a lobby, about a pie from Hartley's Bakery and a blue coat he'd never seen and a woman's laugh in a Brooklyn evening that had reached across 2 lanes of traffic and hit him in a place nothing else had touched in years. "You weren't entirely wrong," he said, "about what I was." He moved toward the exit. "I'm working on the rest." He didn't go back to the tower. He told the driver the penthouse and sat in the back with his hands on his knees and watched the city go by on the other side of the glass and breathed slowly and felt the specific exhaustion that came not from physical effort but from the sustained tension of an evening spent in rooms where everything could have gone a different way and hadn't, and the knowledge that the difference between the way it went and the way it could have gone was largely a matter of the infrastructure working when the man at the center of it wasn't at his best. He got to the penthouse at 1 in the morning. He walked through the rooms, the kitchen with the grocery receipt note no longer on the island because it was in his jacket pocket, the living room where Claire's piano still stood because she hadn't taken it and he hadn't been able to think about what to do with it, the bedroom where her winter coat with the broken zipper still hung on her side of the closet. He sat at the kitchen island and put his hands flat on the cold stone surface and stayed like that for a while. Then he picked up his phone and sent a message to Marcus. Carroll Gardens is clear. Stand down the secondary. Keep the building watch through the week, then remove. Marcus replied in under a minute. Understood. You all right? Adrian looked at the question. Then he typed, getting there. He went to bed at 2 and lay on his back and looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing for a while, which was something he hadn't been able to do in weeks, and eventually slept. The weeks that followed moved differently than any weeks he could remember in the past several years. The Castellano situation resolved in the way Victor had promised. The Trenton accounts were made whole by the second week of December, transferred with the clean efficiency of a man honoring a debt he was ashamed of. The formal alliance restructuring happened through Dominic and Victor's new primary contact, a woman named Sophia, who was professional and precise, and made every conversation significantly more productive than the ones that had involved Marco. Marco himself disappeared from the organization's orbit entirely. Adrian heard through secondary channels that he'd gone to the Castellano family's interests in Miami, a reassignment that had the character of both exile and protection. Luca's operation in Newark was restructured. 3 men were removed and replaced. Luca remained on a shorter arrangement with more oversight and something that had permanently changed in his posture around Adrian, a specific and chastened awareness that had replaced the comfortable assumption of unexamined loyalty. Adrian let it replace it. He didn't punish Luca beyond the restructuring. He'd been used by someone skilled at using people, and the use had relied on the specific assumption that a man could invoke Adrian Volkov's name and not be checked because Adrian Volkov was distracted. That assumption was no longer available. He came into the tower at 7 instead of 6. He left at 7 instead of midnight. He assigned Dominic broader operational authority over the daily management of the empire and trusted him to use it, which Dominic did with the careful diligence of someone who had been waiting years for the responsibility and was not going to squander it. He learned to cook. Not well. He was not a man with natural aptitude for things that required patience and sensory attention operating simultaneously, but adequately. He cooked 3 nights a week in the penthouse kitchen, following recipes he found on his phone, with the same focused intensity he brought to briefing documents, treating garlic and salt with the same seriousness he brought to threat assessments. The results were uneven. He ate them anyway. He went to Hartley's Bakery on West 74th on a Saturday morning in November, 3 days after Red Hook. He stood outside it for a minute first, the way Claire must have stood outside it, and then he went in and bought a coffee and sat at one of the 3 small tables and drank it slowly and looked at the cases of pastry and the old photographs on the walls and thought about a teenager walking past this place and feeling something he'd lost sight of for a very long time. He went back the following Saturday, and the one after that. He called the Carroll Gardens Learning Center's administrative line in the second week of December and asked about volunteer opportunities, giving only his first name. Adrian, no last name, no organizational affiliation, a phone number that was routed through an exchange that traced back to nothing identifiable. Ruth Okafor called him back herself and asked about his background and what he was hoping to contribute. And he told her he had time on Tuesday evenings and could help with the adult literacy program if they needed people. She said they always needed people. He went on a Tuesday in mid-December for the first time. He did not tell Claire. He worked with 3 adults that evening. A man in his 50s, relearning to read after a stroke had rewired things. A young woman who'd arrived from another country 3 months earlier and was building English from the ground up. And an older woman named Patricia, who could read perfectly well, but had always had trouble with writing, and at 71 had decided she was done being embarrassed about it. He sat with each of them for 20 to 30 minutes, with the same patient attention he would have told you 6 months ago he did not possess. And he learned something in that first Tuesday evening that he could not have learned anywhere in the structure of his professional life. That attention, real attention, was not a finite resource being depleted each time you gave it. It was the opposite. It accumulated. It built something. Claire was not there that Tuesday. She was there the following week, a Wednesday. He was helping Patricia with a letter she wanted to write to her estranged daughter when he heard Claire's voice in the doorway of the adjoining room. She was greeting Ruth Okafor, saying something about the reading materials she'd brought, her voice carrying the specific warmth it had when she was in a place that belonged to her. He kept his attention on Patricia and the letter. Patricia was trying to write, "I should have said this sooner," and the word sooner was giving her trouble. "Sound it out," he said. "Don't think about the whole word, just the first sound." "S," Patricia said. "Right, then?" He did not look at the doorway. He stayed with Patricia and the word and the specific work of the moment, and somewhere in the room behind him he heard Claire's voice moving through the space as she settled into her own work. And he did not turn around, and Patricia wrote sooner correctly on her third try, and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had just reclaimed something she'd been told was beyond her. "There it is," he said. Patricia laughed, the laugh of genuine surprise at yourself. He looked up then, not at the doorway, but at the room, at the people in it doing the small and difficult work of learning things that other people had told them were too late, and he felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in so long that he needed a moment to identify it. Useful. He felt useful. Not powerful. Not strategic. Not several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Just useful. He left at 8:30 without crossing Claire's path. He went home and cooked badly and ate it and went to bed at a reasonable hour. He went back the following Tuesday. Chat. He ran into Claire for the first time in mid-January. Not at the center, on the street outside, a Tuesday evening, both of them reaching the door at approximately the same time from opposite directions. She stopped when she saw him. He stopped. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had been told something and was now seeing it with their own eyes and finding that the two versions of the information were different in texture. "Ruth mentioned a new volunteer," she said. "Adrian." "Yes." She didn't mention a last name. "I didn't give one." She looked at him for a moment. Not cold, not warm, the careful temperature of someone who had been burned and was not standing close to any source of heat until she understood it better. "How long?" she said. "December. 4 weeks. Tuesdays. Sometimes Saturdays. There's a children's program Saturday mornings." She absorbed this. Her breath was visible in the January cold. "You volunteer with the children's program?" "I do." "Adrian Volkov." "I understand how that sounds." She looked away briefly, down the street, at the lights of the neighborhood, at the ordinary Tuesday evening traffic of people going about lives that had nothing to do with either of them. When she looked back, something had shifted slightly in her face. Not softened, shifted. "I'm not doing this to get you back," he said. "I'm not here because I thought you'd see me, and I'm not running a strategy, Claire. I know how everything I've done looks like a strategy. I know you have no reason to believe there's a difference." He looked at the door of the building. "I'm here because the first night I volunteered, I sat with a 71-year-old woman who was trying to write sooner and couldn't, and when she finally did, she laughed. And He stopped. He was not good at this. He had never been good at this, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. "I hadn't been somewhere that felt like something real in a very long time." Claire looked at him. Her hands were in her coat pockets. The blue coat. The one from that Friday evening on the Carroll Gardens sidewalk when he'd sat in the car across the street and seen her laugh. "You look different," she said. "I've been sleeping." "That's not what I mean." He didn't try to fill the sentence she'd left incomplete. He waited. "I heard about the Castellano situation," she said. "Not details. I don't need details, but I heard that something happened and it was resolved. It was resolved. And after it was resolved." She looked at him carefully. "You stayed." "I stayed." "At the center?" "Yes." She looked at him for another moment. Then she pulled the door open and held it, and he understood after a second what the gesture was, and he went in. They worked in separate rooms that Tuesday. They left the building at the same time at 8:30, stood for a moment on the steps in the cold. "There's a coffee place on De Gras," she said. "They're open until 9. He looked at her. "All right," he said. They walked to De Gras Street and sat at a table in the back of a small coffee place with exposed pipes and mismatched chairs, and drank coffee and talked for 40 minutes in the specific way of two people who have been many things to each other and are figuring out what's left. Not easily, not smoothly. There were pauses that lasted too long, and there were things said that didn't land right and had to be walked back. And there was one moment when she said something about the Thursday dinners that put his jaw tight in a way he couldn't entirely control, because the truth she was describing was true, and there was no defense of it, and there was also the specific pain of being the person who had caused something you couldn't uncause. But they stayed at the table. They finished the coffee and walked out into the cold, and she went toward the subway, and he went toward the car that was waiting around the block. And halfway down the street, she turned and said, "Same time next Tuesday," and went on without waiting for an answer. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He was smiling. He noticed this with the slight surprise of a man who has been so long in rooms where smiling communicated weakness that the experience of doing it without calculation had become unfamiliar. He went to his car and went home. The weeks continued to move. February arrived and the city went gray and cold in the way only February could manage. Not dramatically, just relentlessly. A gray so settled it began to feel like weather had given up on having any other ideas. Adrian went to the center Tuesdays and Saturdays. He got better at cooking, not in the sense of becoming a cook, but in the sense of making food that was edible and occasionally something more than that. He went to Hartley's on Saturday mornings before the children's program, bought a coffee, sat at the small table, and read whatever he found in the stack of newspapers the owner kept by the door. He and Claire had coffee on De Gras Street after the Tuesday sessions. Not every Tuesday. Some Tuesdays they were busy or tired, or the timing didn't work. And he did not manufacture reasons for it to work because manufacturing reasons was the old way of operating, and he was trying, with the genuine difficulty of a man whose defaults were all strategic, to let things develop at their own speed. He bought groceries himself. The security team followed at distance. That was not something that was going to stop, was never going to stop. That was the cost of the life he'd built. But he walked through the produce section of the Brooklyn grocery store on Saturdays, choosing tomatoes, with the specific bewilderment of a person doing something ordinary for the first time, and finding it, against expectations, grounding. He arranged flowers in the penthouse. Not because Claire would see them, she wasn't there to see them, but because she had always arranged flowers and the rooms had looked different with them, more like places people actually lived, and he was trying to understand what that had meant to her, the specific work of making a space feel inhabited. He anonymously donated a significant amount of books to the Carroll Gardens Learning Center's library in February, routed through a foundation name that traced back to nothing identifiable. Ruth Okafor sent out an email to all volunteers celebrating the donation. He read it at his desk in the tower and felt something he was starting to get better at identifying: satisfaction without audience. He sent Claire a text in the third week of February. Not about the center, not about the Castellano situation, nothing with an agenda. A photo he'd taken that morning of the Hartley's sign from outside, early light making it look like something from another era. No caption. She sent back, "You went back." He sent, "Every Saturday." A pause of a few minutes. Then, "They make a good apple tart on Saturdays, in case you haven't tried it." He hadn't tried it. The following Saturday, he ordered it with the coffee and ate it at the small table and thought about a woman who had driven to this bakery because he'd mentioned it once 3 years ago, who had carried that small, unguarded thing he'd said and brought it to him when she was trying one last time, who had written 4 sentences on a grocery receipt because she deserved 30 minutes, and she knew it, and she'd asked for it anyway. He had told Marcus he wouldn't care if she walked away. He thought about that sentence regularly, not with guilt exactly. Guilt was a feeling that belonged to the moment of the mistake, and he'd moved past the moment, but with the specific awareness of a man who has identified the precise location of a catastrophic error and was using the knowledge of it to build something different. He thought about the 43rd floor conference room and what it would have cost him to lift his eyes from his papers when she appeared in the doorway. Just that. Just to look up. The distance between what had happened and what could have happened was not a chasm. It was not insurmountable terrain or the product of fundamental incompatibility. It was 53 minutes in a lobby and one sentence said to the wrong person in a room where the door was open. He carried that knowledge the way you carried a scar, not as an open wound, but as a reminder of exactly where the skin had failed and what it had taken to close. The Saturday before Easter was warm in the specific way of early spring days that arrived before spring had fully committed. Still cool in the shade, genuinely warm in the sun. The city suddenly full of people who had forgotten what it felt like to not brace against the cold. The children's program at the Carroll Gardens Learning Center had organized a reading festival. Ruth Okafor had been planning it since January. Books donated, tables set up in the center's small courtyard, activities for children and adults both. The neighborhood had been invited. It was the kind of event that the building was exactly the right size for, which meant it overflowed pleasantly into the street and the adjacent sidewalk and felt like the thing it was supposed to feel like. Adrian arrived at 9 to help set up. He moved tables and carried book boxes and argued mildly with Patricia about whether the chairs should face the garden or the street, and Patricia won because Patricia always won, and he moved the chairs. Claire arrived at 9:30. She helped Ruth with the activity tables and organized the children's reading corner with the efficient warmth he had watched her apply to this place for months now, the specific competence of a woman in an environment that was entirely hers. They worked in proximity all morning without making it a thing. That was something they'd gotten better at in the months since January, being near each other without the specific weight of everything they were being near each other inside of. It was not easy. It was also not as hard as it had been. At noon, the festival was running at full capacity. Children with books, adults at tables, Patricia demonstrating to a small audience how to write a letter to someone you should have written sooner. Adrian was at the book station helping a boy of about 8 choose between 2 books on space exploration, arguing earnestly that the one with better photographs was not necessarily the better book for understanding how things actually worked. And the boy was not convinced, and Adrian was letting him be unconvinced, because the boy was right that the photographs were better. He looked up from the book discussion and saw Claire standing at the edge of the courtyard, watching him. She was holding something. He couldn't see what it was from where he stood. She had the expression of someone who had made a decision and was standing behind it with the specific stillness that followed a decision rather than preceded it. He finished the book conversation. The boy took both books, which was the correct resolution, and ran back to his mother and walked to where Claire was standing. She was holding a manila envelope. He looked at it. He knew what it was before she said anything, because he had been waiting for it the way you waited for something you'd been told was coming for months, had arranged yourself to accept, had tried to build a version of yourself that could receive without breaking. "I never filed them," she said. He looked up from the envelope to her face. "The divorce papers." She looked at the envelope in her hands. "I had them for months. My lawyer called twice." She paused. "I kept telling her I needed more time." He waited. "I told myself I was being cautious," she said, "that I needed to be certain, that I'd been certain about things before and been wrong." She looked at him. The morning light in the courtyard made her eyes darker than they were in the center's indoor light, and the early spring sun was on the side of her face, and she looked tired in the way of a person who has been honest with herself for a very long time, and the honesty has been costly. "And then I watched you for 4 months. I know you were watching," he said. I wasn't trying to perform anything." "I know," she said. "That's the thing. That's why I was watching." She looked back at the envelope. "You came every Tuesday. You stayed. You helped with the children's program on Saturdays. You learned Patricia's name and her daughter's name, and you remember details about the reading programs that the college volunteers forgot half the time." She paused. "You didn't tell me you were donating the books." He was quiet. "Ruth told me." She half smiled. Not fully, not warmly, something that was still deciding what it was. She said whoever did it specifically requested that the children's nonfiction section be prioritized. She thought you'd told me about it. I didn't want you to think it was... I know, she said again, quietly. I know what you didn't want me to think. She looked at the envelope one more time. Then she held it out to him. He took it. It was heavier than he'd expected. He turned it over in his hands and looked at it and then looked at her. This doesn't mean everything is... she started. I know it doesn't. It's not a clean slate. It's not starting over. It's... She seemed to search for the word. It's a door being left open, for now. And what happens with that door is going to take time. And it's going to be uneven. And there are going to be days when I'm not sure. And I need you to not use your particular skill set on those days to manage the situation. I understand. I mean it, Adrian. The moment I feel managed, you'll close the door, he said. I understand. And you should. She looked at him. He held the look without deflecting it, without the strategic management of his own face that had been his operating mode for 20 years, in every room where something important was at stake. He let her see what was there, which was not certainty and not performance, but the specific and imperfect face of a man who had broken something he should never have broken, and had spent months in the slow, unglamorous work of becoming someone it made sense to trust. Okay, she said. Not I forgive you, not I love you. Just the particular okay of a woman who had looked at the available evidence and decided to take one more careful step. They stood in the courtyard of the Carroll Gardens Learning Center while the reading festival went on around them. Children with books, neighbors at tables, Patricia conducting her letter-writing demonstration with the authority of someone who had finally claimed her own voice. I made coffee in the kitchen before you got here, Claire said. There's some left if you want it. He did. They walked inside together, past the book tables and the reading corners and the handmade sign that said, Stories Change Lives, that one of the children's program kids had made in November, and Ruth had put up and never taken down. The building smelled the same as it always had, wood floors and paper and the specific warmth of a space that was full of people doing something that mattered to them. In the kitchen, Claire poured 2 cups. He took his and stood at the counter beside her, and they drank it in the quiet of the back of the building while the festival noise came through from the courtyard. And it was not the penthouse, and it was not the 43rd floor, and it was not any room where anything had ever been decided or managed or arranged. It was a kitchen in Brooklyn, and 2 cups of coffee, and the specific ordinary difficulty of 2 people figuring out what they were to each other after everything that had happened. He thought about saying something true, something that might land right. He thought about the 53 minutes in the lobby, the 4-sentence note, the sentence he'd said without looking up from his papers. He did not try to make it into a speech. He had learned, in the past 4 months, that the things worth saying were usually shorter than the things that sounded worth saying. Thank you, he said, for not filing them. She looked at her coffee. Don't make me regret it. I won't, he said. Outside, Patricia was finishing her demonstration. Her voice carried through the window, reading aloud what she'd written, the letter to her daughter, the one about sooner, the word she'd finally learned to write at 71 years old in a room where a man who had built an empire on the refusal to show weakness had sat with her and said just the first sound, just the first part. Her voice was steady and unhurried and had in it everything that years of silence had been holding, finally finding its way into words on a page and then out into the April air. Adrian stood in the kitchen in Brooklyn and listened. He was not the most feared man in any room he was in right now. He was not several steps ahead of everyone. He was not running anything or managing anything or controlling the terrain. He was standing next to his wife drinking mediocre coffee while a 71-year-old woman read a letter she'd written to her daughter to a courtyard full of strangers, and outside the kitchen window the first real warmth of spring was settling over Carroll Gardens, and it was enough. It was, he was beginning to understand, more than enough. It was the only thing in the end that had ever been.